In this video, we're going to be discussing the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland and what we really need to know for the MCAT. So, remember that the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are both found in the brain, and they are involved in the endocrine system. However, the hypothalamus, besides being involved in the endocrine system, it also has a lot of other functions, right? So we call that an endocrine organ because besides releasing hormones, it also plays other physiological roles, including regulating the sleep-wake cycle, having a role in emotional processing, temperature regulation, hunger regulation, as well as regulation of the autonomic nervous system, right? And then it also has endocrine functions. This is unlike the anterior pituitary gland, which is a true endocrine gland, because it only releases hormones. That's its only function. And we call the anterior pituitary gland the master endocrine gland because it basically tells all the other endocrine organs and glands what to do, like how to regulate their hormone-releasing functions. The hypothalamus, however, will actually regulate the function of the anterior pituitary, right? So I kind of like to compare the hypothalamus to like the CEO of a company, right? Because it will kind of tell everyone what to do. The anterior pituitary is kind of like the manager because it kind of delegates the tasks to all the individual workers, which are all like the smaller endocrine glands and organs, okay? So let's talk about how they are connected. So anatomically, you can see that the hypothalamus, right, and we are zooming into a part of the brain here. The hypothalamus is located above the anterior pituitary. And the hypothalamus is made up of neurons. However, these neurons are actually neuroendocrine cells because they produce hormones and they release them into this blood, into the bloodstream, right? So they are not, they are actually releasing hormones because they're being released into the blood. And notice that specifically connecting the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus is this hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system. And this is a special type of blood vessel network because it's two capillary beds connected by a portal vessel like this. And so these neuroendocrine cells in the hypothalamus will release hormones into this hypothalamic-hypophyseal portal system, and they will travel to the anterior pituitary gland and tell the anterior pituitary gland how to release its hormones and when. Okay. Now, also the hypothalamus will produce a couple of other hormones which will actually be released from the posterior pituitary gland because some of these neurons will actually extend their axons all the way into this posterior pituitary, and then from there they will release the hormones into the bloodstream, okay? And then the anterior pituitary will of course release its hormones just into the general bloodstream, and they will go to the other endocrine organs and tell them what to do. So next, let's actually talk about the different hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and how they relate and kind of what they do in general. Okay, so now let's talk about the different hormones released by these two endocrine organs, okay? So first of all, the hypothalamus is going to release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, aka GnRH. And GnRH is a tropic hormone because it will tell the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH and LH. And these are two direct hormones, okay, FSH and LH, because they will actually go and signal the gonads, either ovaries in females or testes in males, to basically change their activity in some way. And I'll make a separate video on that because that's a pretty complex topic. Now, CRH is corticotropin-releasing hormone, right? And this will actually tell the anterior pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, and this should be an R, as ACTH, or excuse me, that was correct actually. So that's my mistake. Adrenocorticotropin-releasing hormone. And ACTH will, of course, signal the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. So that's part of the stress axis. That's going to be regulating sort of long-term stress. Now, TRH is thyrotropic-releasing hormone. And this is actually going to tell the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which is thyroid-stimulating hormone, which will then tell the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. Now, dopamine, okay, this is one of the regions of the brain where dopamine is actually produced. There's multiple regions. And in the hypothalamus, dopamine is actually also referred to as prolactin inhibiting hormone because it's going to inhibit the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary gland. So in this case, it's not a positive tropic hormone, it's an inhibitory tropic hormone, a negatively tropic hormone, because it inhibits the release of a hormone from the anterior pituitary. So when dopamine is not being released, prolactin is being released. But when dopamine is being released, there's no prolactin. And remember that prolactin is actually what's going to stimulate breast milk production. Now, there's also growth hormone releasing hormone, which is going to tell the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And notice that the anterior pituitary is also going to be producing what we call endorphins, which are hormones that are involved in pain regulation, okay, or regulation of the sensation and perception of pain. Okay, and generally they have an analgesic effect where they inhibit pain sensation, okay? And there's a really good mnemonic to memorize the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, which is actually flat peg. So if you look at the first letter of each of these hormones of the anterior pituitary, it's FLAT, so flat, and then PEG, which is peg. And this is a very useful mnemonic because if you remember it this way, the first four letters that make up flat, right, these are all the tropic hormones, right? Because when these are released, these are actually going to tell other endocrine glands and organs in the body to change their hormone releasing activity. Like with FSH and LH, it'll be to the gonads to change release and production of like testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, which are all hormones. ACTH will tell the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. TSH will tell the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Now, these latter three, these are actually all direct hormones. And direct hormones are those that instead of telling endocrine or like basically other organs in general to release hormones, instead they change some other physiological activity of those cells. So for example, prolactin promotes production of breast milk specifically. Endorphins are gonna, play a role in pain sensation. Growth hormone is going to tell, our muscles and our bones to grow and also regulate metabolism. Okay, so that's a really useful mnemonic, flat peg. Now, the hypothalamus is also going to produce two other hormones. And unlike the other ones we've talked about, these are actually direct hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Now, these are the ones that are actually produced in the hypothalamus and ultimately released from the posterior pituitary gland, posterior pituitary. So a really important thing to remember, because they can try to trick you with this on the MCAT, is the posterior pituitary does not produce these hormones. Instead, it just stores them. It's the hypothalamus that actually produces them. And that's why the posterior pituitary is not an actual endocrine organ or a gland, frankly, or specifically it's not an endocrine gland because it doesn't produce its own hormones, okay? Now, oxytocin, these are direct hormones because instead of telling cells to release hormones, they alter other physiological functions. Like oxytocin, it's a complex hormone, but it generally tells smooth muscle cells to contract, like promotes uterine contractions and promotes contraction of smooth muscle around the mammillary ducts to contract, which helps with release of breast milk. And then oxytocin is also thought to be very important in bonding behaviors, okay? Now, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, this one is also referred to as vasopressin, okay? And it has multiple functions. So ADH, first of all, in the kidney is going to promote reabsorption of water. And this is done actually to help with salt balance in the bloodstream. Okay, so if there's too high a concentration of salt in the bloodstream, for instance, ADH will be released and you will reabsorb water to dilute the blood. Now, when it acts in the blood vessels, ADH is referred to as vasopressin because it actually causes direct constriction of blood vessels, which also helps to increase blood pressure. So remember, there's a lot of hormones that are released here, but if you can remember how they relate to each other and group them into these categories of tropic and direct, I think it makes it easier to remember. And you don't have to remember all the complex functions of these hormones, just know one or two functions and kind of predict when they will be released and when they won't be released.